All right, amazing people. Okay, I am so excited again to be here with you all for Dear Grant Funder Part 3. And today's discussion will focus on conversations that need to happen. So, if you again are new to this channel or following Cares Group Consulting or myself, I'm Shanquetta Cunningham, nonprofit strategist, consultant, facilitator, and founder of Cares Group Consulting. And I'm so glad to have you join me for part 3 of Dear Grant Funder. So, if you've been rocking since part 1, you know, this conversation started as a heartfelt appeal to grant makers, funders, philanthropic partners to see the reality of rural and small nonprofits, the zip codes again that doesn't have the large numbers, but are certainly making large impact. And these organizations, especially someone who lives in Arkansas and in northeast Arkansas, where most people would consider the Delta, I see great impact having happening day in and day out. But I also see many organizations that are often overlooked, underfunded, and under-resourced, but are expected to come and show up and have the capacity as larger nonprofit organizations. And so we started with part 1 with visibility. Last week, we moved to responsibility. And today, I want to just move further and let's discuss the conversation that, needs to happen around rural, small, micro, nonprofit organizations. And this is not to say that these conversations are not happening, right? I have been involved and invited to roundtables, host them myself through the nonprofit summit that we host, or just being invited to other conversations. And so I do know that these conversations are happening. I also know that there are sometimes some weight and a lot of filters that happen with these conversations because the reality, these conversations are hard and they're tough. And not only for grant making organizations and funders and foundation teams and grant makers, and they're tough for nonprofit organizations to admit when they have been, or to acknowledge when they've been overlooked or under resourced. And then it's actually hard for uh, grant making entities to often, to support that because again, you know, toes are stepped on or uh, hearts are bleeding. But I believe that if we are all coming together with the goal of moving forward, the conversations is one of those gut moments. I know what it is to have those gut moments when you're striving to do good and striving to make a difference and you make those mistakes or you have to make those acknowledgments. But the beautiful thing about it is the awareness that there has been some discrepancies, some systematic frameworks that have excluded rural or micro or small or minority nonprofit organizations. And then the boldness to say, let's make that change. So again, going back to, just the weight of the conversation, there's conversations that I know that you all are experiencing as grant funders and grant makers that's going on in the public sector in general. You're dealing with transitions in national priorities with the new administration, federal and state funding cuts that may or may not be appropriate or uh, understandable. And leave that there. And so, and also the other side of it to where you are having to deal with um, the needs of nonprofits because of these funding shifts that's happening within the government. But then, as you are reviewing grant proposals, you may have noticed that you're going from reviewing 300 proposals to now 600 because while I am an advocate for nonprofit equity, we also sometimes forget that the nonprofit sector is a market, and the market has definitely increased with competition. Because of AI and ChatGPT and grant writing software. And so other organizations that have not been a part of, in the grant funding cycles and the solicitation cycles, you're now reviewing those proposals at, in an influx rate. And so all of these things are part of our new realities, and cannot be ignored when we're talking about, how do we help the zip codes that are often, overlooked, or under resourced. And these are part of your realities as well as you're making decisions. So another part of this conversation, as well as we're talking about, um, just how do we move forward when we recognize these deficits with smaller organizations in rural areas, in minority-led nonprofits and micro nonprofits that again are on the ground doing the work, but you too are dealing with these shifting priorities, and also being responders yourselves in these times of crisis. I am constantly seeing from different foundations, and especially I subscribe to various grant making foundations, or just looking at the leadership on LinkedIn, and you're seeing the post, or you're seeing the nonprofit organizations, and they're sharing how you are deploying grant funds and immediate assistance, not based on proposals or the open grant cycle, or because they're a new program or innovation, but simply you're having to step in to allocate additional grant funds where federal funding streams have been eliminated. That's survival work indeed, not transformational work. And you're answering the call as well and being on the front lines in this space, in this changing of space of philanthropy, outreach, and government support. All of these things are changing. So it again stirs up, we're talking about conversation. These are conversations that are happening out loud, or as you are on your Zoom and gathering your board members or your trustees or your advisory boards or your largest donors. These are conversations that are crucial. And often the other side to this deployment, and you are stepping in as grant making entities and funders, that these decisions sometimes are going to larger nonprofit organizations or in cities, because we hear about the massive. I just read something about the situation that's going on with federal funding that's been cut off in the Bronx and this program, and how they've lost millions. And so we are seeing conversation that's being, you know, directed towards the Bronx and the thousands of students for sure that do need help and do need support, and that it escapes because we hear the larger city, the thousands, and so we see the number, and we have the organizations such as in Arkansas, Mississippi, or Appalachian territories, and where we may have programs that have been cut at the same time, but they're only serving 45. How do we balance these conversations, and how do we measure the larger or greater impact? And so these are the complexities, right, of the changing landscape of the public sector as it is under this current administration, when it comes to federal funding, and even yourself as how you are answering the call. So with especially LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. I love the gathering space for professionals and peers in this space. And I'm also seeing how there is conversation happening around what is truly philanthropy. And even for myself as a consultant in this space, I have to ensure that I am not measuring or looking at philanthropy only on the scope of funding and grant making. Even if we break up the word philanthropy, Philo meaning love, anthropy, humanity. So love for humanity. This means philanthropy is larger and bigger than a check. It's a posture of community, of shared responsibility, of ensuring that the neighbor that lacks will become, well, today, the neighbor that lacks will become the one who has help and can help tomorrow. It's sharing the conversation that when you have more, that there is a responsibility to give. Um, and not that it's a responsibility of anyone to act like the Superman, or it's up to one organization, or it's up to rich people, right? Everyday philanthropy is truly the philanthropy in the giving that transforms communities. It's like local government. What happens at the local level and at the county level has far greater impact in the immediate and in the long term than what happens in our governmental sector. We are in unique times now where funding is shifting to where those are some immediate situations taking place, but on an everyday basis, it's the local policies and procedures, right, that have the greater impact. And that's the same with giving. That's the same with helping your neighbor in need. And that's the same with philanthropy. So philanthropy is this entire construct, right? Of giving, of serving, of supporting, of helping, of enhancing, of fostering, of lifting, all of these vision words that we use to address problems and bring solutions in our communities. But also in this, I see where the process of professionalized giving, we've too systematized compassion. We've created so many steps of who and what deserves support that the ones closest to the need can't reach the funding. And so I'm asking funders and givers and donators. I'm asking you, if you are a nonprofit leader that's watching this video or will watch the replay, what does the future look like? What conversations do we need to have that may or may not can be had with our government leaders, that should be had, and that we want to continue the conversation? But what do we do in the instance to where there's stalling, there's cutting, there's eliminating? How do we determine, how do you determine as grant funders, what is the funding priority now? And so, as a consultant, in championing nonprofit equity and support and philanthropy, growth and capacity building, and all these things, right? That's needed so that we can see the outcomes of what we desire in philanthropy and in support and in helping. I have a front row seat to both sides of this. And so, some of the questions that I want to place before you, if you're working with your team now, if you're on your leadership retreat, or you're about to, embark upon your leadership retreat, and you need an awesome facilitator in that. But the larger part of this conversation on today, these are some questions that I'm thinking about, and I hope that you can add to your thought process and your strategic planning processes as well. What are the brave conversations that we need to have together, nonprofit grant makers and philanthropic leaders and givers and giving circles and nonprofit organizations and faith-based communities? What are the conversations that we need to have together? What would it look like if funders invited nonprofit leaders to co-design equitable funding pathways? What would happen if the voices of the nonprofits that you want to fund and that desire to fund are a part of your process right from the start or in the redesign phase? What would happen if foundations use their platforms as well to advocate for federal and state funding sources? Right? What would this access and the priorities look like and benefit smaller communities? How would that support? It could totally transform grant giving. It can totally transform these spaces, because the reality to this conversation as well is that grant makers, you are influencers and you have a greater access and will be invited to these tables or to these court hearings or to the Senate meetings right first, because as people that steward billions of dollars will, wealth has a language. And so you're able to open doors and get into rooms quicker to spaces of with governmental leaders, people with deeper pockets, prestige that everyday leaders may not have access to. And so these are the conversations that I'm hoping that as you are moving forward for consideration, excuse me, using and understanding that a part of capacity building is access and knowledge building of the process of these decisions. When you're a nonprofit organization that runs a food kitchen in a town of 1,800 people, you are striving to survive not only for yourself, but then ensure that you have enough to feed the people that come to you day in and day out. They may not know the jargon, the political language, right? Or even the language that you are really looking for that makes organizations exemplary or the standard for funding. So, what if we shift and actually have these conversations, bring down some of the jargon, take off some of the boxes on the checklist, and then also elevate the language and understanding of the people that you want to serve? We're all in the same room. I hear it all the time. And that's the room for improvement. And I believe now this is a great time to revisit, to re-engage, or to start to enhance and elevate these conversations in a more intentional way. So as I conclude, in part three of Dear Grant Funders, I just don't want to be, having this conversation and sharing my thoughts as a consultant and a professional um, uh, facilitator or anything of that sort without saying whether you invite me into this space or not. These are things I want from the foundations in Arkansas to globally to consider that I've been seeing them happen, but I do think that it's time to elevate and design moderated listening spaces between foundations and community-based leaders, especially micro-sized, rural, minority-led nonprofit organizations, because sometimes the story behind the grant application is what changes everything. The everyday considerations, the mental understanding of what goes on in the mindset of leaders when they're tackling issues that they sometimes too themselves are facing. And then two, offer funder strategic insight reports into on behalf of, sorry, offering you as funders strategic insight reports that's right from the field. One of the greatest part of the work that I do is being able to consistently be in touch with grassroots leaders, rural communities, and minority micro-led nonprofit organizations. I've often shared that it's kind of like you see your favorite celebrity that may do all of these cross-country tours, and they are now considered the uh, celebrity A and on the A list and all of these things, but they always do this one thing that grounds them to their work. Like they may still visit the hospitals twice a year because that's how they started. And they said no matter what level of success I arrives to and will claim to, I will always go back to this basis. For me, I make that analogy because no matter the platforms or the rooms or the stages, one of the things that I want to always do and will always do is be hands on the ground and be in the small places that may have 340 people in one stoplight. Because I know that getting into these communities, being on the ground, getting to the spaces, having a meeting that may serve as a restaurant, and Also, just the town square as well. But it's these places that hold the heart of philanthropy and community. And I think that it's important to have field agents to create these strategic insight reports that are able to capture emerging needs and gaps in access and then being able to correspond that with the trends in nonprofit capacity to share with these leaders to be that facilitator because this gives you as grant funders real-time awareness of what's happening in areas where you want to fund but you don't have the relationships. You want to know what's happening without assuming, and these insights can then help shape how we're developing the RFPs and really support advocacy at the state or federal level because you have the data, not just the evaluation reports from a funded program, but that pre solicitation, that pre conversation that is often so necessary. And so, what is the next step? Today, we focus on conversation, right? We know that we can build the whole staircase, but just the next right step. Is that scheduling a conversation with local nonprofit leaders that you never funded? I've shared this, in the past couple of videos as well. Is it reviewing your application process, not only for accessibility, but during COVID, I noticed how funders were very strategic in streamlining their application process. Some have went back to the old, or their standard way. But what would happen if we actually had that same level of compassion? Because we know that the COVID funding is drying up. We also know that access is getting harder because of other things that are happening. So would that, help in supporting rural and micro and small nonprofit organizations? Also, could the next right step be inviting people into your boardrooms to share what's really happening and truly listening and sharing with them today? We listen. I don't know if you've ever been in whatever relationship, whether it's spouse or parent to child. Sometimes we see how people are just relieved and uplifted simply by having someone listen to them. And that's no different from nonprofit organizations, big or small. So philanthropy is evolving, and we don't have to navigate this in silos. And I just hope that part three of today's conversation can really be a catalyst to start or enhance the conversations that's desperately needed about the changing landscape of philanthropy and how that impacts organizations, especially in the unfamiliar, untouristy, zip codes, because philanthropy, large scale, small scale, right? It's about the impact of humanity and changing lives from 1 to 1,000. So I just want to say thank you so much for leaning in. Uh, Thank you for engaging in this conversation. Thank you for your commitment. If you're watching this, to say, hey, it's time. We're going to at least take one of these steps and start these conversations. Again, I'm Shanquetta Cunningham of Cares Group Consulting, and our work is rooted in strategy and community rooted uh, facilitation that exists to bridge the gap between grassroots organizations, philanthropy, public systems, grant making entities. We train hundreds of nonprofit leaders. Uh, Currently in Arkansas, host the only and consistent nonprofit summit that gathers nonprofit leaders from 3 and 4 states around our region. But most importantly, I'm just I love and we love investing into nonprofit leaders, nonprofit organizations with real strategy, with real information for larger scale impact. And so, if you are a funder, government partner, or foundation that's looking to move the needle forward from intention or this conversation to implementation, and you want someone that's on the ground that can navigate both in the space that's needed in your boardroom conversations to also being on the ground to facilitate these learning sessions and capacity building workshops and frameworks with organizations and with their leadership, then we'd love to partner with you. So let's take this conversation to the next step. Let's build it. And I thank you so much for joining on part three for Dear Grant Funder. Tune in next week for part four of Dear Grant Funder. I'm enjoying this series. I don't know how many parts we'll have, but I certainly welcome you back for part four. And you all have an amazing Wednesday and great rest of the week. Please like, share this video as well. Thank you.